The moment Clara Whitfield turned 32, her mother sat her down at the kitchen table and told her, with the same businesslike calm she used to discuss the price of flour, that no decent man would ever want her now. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas wind was rattling the shutters of the Whitfield homestead just outside of Dodge City, and Clara sat very still while her mother's words settled over her like a layer of cold ash. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over such things long ago. She simply folded her hands in her lap, looked out the window at the flat brown prairie stretching endlessly toward the horizon, and nodded once, the way you nod when someone tells you the weather is going to be poor. Her mother, Edith Whitfield, was a stout woman with iron-gray hair pinned so severely that it seemed to pull the softness right out of her face. She had been a practical woman her entire life, and she applied that same blunt practicality to every subject, including the romantic prospects of her eldest daughter. "You had your chances," Edith said, tapping the table with one thick finger. "Hector Prout asked for your hand in '72 and you turned him down. Dale Mossman came calling in '74 and you sent him off. Now you are 32 years old, and there is not a man between here and Wichita who is going to look twice at a woman your age." Clara's younger sister, Louisa, sat across the table pretending to mend a stocking, though she had not made a single stitch in the last 10 minutes. She was 24, pretty in a soft, peach-cheeked way, recently married to a cattleman named George Holt who had more ambition than sense but at least had a good jaw. Louisa glanced up at Clara with something that was almost pity, but was closer to relief. The relief of a woman who had escaped a fate she had always been vaguely afraid of. "Mama," Louisa said carefully, "perhaps Clara will meet someone yet." At 32, Edith made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The men who are still unmarried at that age are unmarried for a reason, Louisa, and the good ones have been taken since they were 25. Clara pushed her chair back from the table. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands when they are deciding something, and she smoothed the front of her calico dress and said, "I am going to start on supper." That was the end of the conversation, at least on the surface. But something had shifted inside Clara's chest. Some small, tight thing that had been holding its shape for years finally bent under the weight of those words. Not broken exactly. Bent. And sometimes bent things are more dangerous than broken ones, because they still have tension in them, still have the capacity to snap back. The Whitfield homestead had been her father's dream and her mother's burden since Elias Whitfield had died of fever in the winter of 1873, leaving behind 40 acres of mediocre grazing land, 3 milk cows, a leaky roof, and 3 children. The eldest had been Clara, then 19. Then there was Louisa, and the youngest was their brother Thomas, who was 17 now and already spending more time in Dodge City than on the farm, learning the wrong lessons from the right sort of trouble. Clara had stayed. She had stayed when Louisa married and moved 3 miles up the road. She had stayed when Thomas started disappearing for days at a time. She had stayed because someone had to, and because she was the eldest, and because, if she was honest with herself in the deep, honest hours of the night, she had not yet found a reason compelling enough to leave. That was the truth she didn't tell her mother. She had not turned down Hector Prout and Dale Mossman out of stubbornness or foolish romantic idealism. She had turned them down because neither of them had ever once made her feel like the world was larger than the 40 acres she already knew. She wanted the world to feel larger. She had always wanted that. She was standing at the iron cookstove on the evening of April the 14th, 1878, stirring a pot of beef stew that smelled of onion and thyme and the dried wild garlic she gathered from the creek bank every spring, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. This was not unusual. The road that cut past the Whitfield property connected Dodge City to several smaller homesteads further south, and travelers passed often enough that Clara had learned to distinguish between the leisurely clop of a farmer going home and the urgent rhythm of someone in a hurry. This was neither. This was one horse moving at a careful, measured walk, the way a horse walks when its rider is paying close attention to something. She did not go to the window right away. She kept stirring. Then she heard the creak of the yard gate, which meant whoever it was had turned off the road and come onto the property, and she wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the kitchen window. The man outside was leading a bay horse by the reins, and the horse had a distinct lean to the left that told Clara the animal was favoring its right foreleg. The man himself was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a duster that had seen considerable use and a hat that had been through at least one serious storm. He was looking down at the horse's leg with an expression of focused concern, and then he looked up at the house, and even from the window Clara could see that he was weighing something, deciding whether to knock. He knocked. She opened the door before her mother could get to it, because Edith answered the door to strangers the way a judge pronounces a verdict, and Clara didn't feel like watching that tonight. The man on the porch was perhaps 35, maybe 36, with a face that had been weathered by years of open sky. He had dark eyes, deep set beneath strong brows, and a jaw shadowed with several days of dark stubble. His hat was in his hands now, which she noted because it was a small piece of courtesy that cost him nothing and meant something. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and careful, shaped by the South. "Texas," she thought, or maybe Missouri. "I apologize for disturbing you. My horse has come up lame, and I was hoping I might have your permission to rest him in your yard for the night, if you have a corner of space to spare. I'll be gone before sunup, and I won't cause any trouble." Clara looked past him at the horse, who was standing with one foreleg extended and the hoof barely touching the ground. "That looks like a stone bruise," she said. The man blinked, not because he disagreed, but because he had expected her to send him away or call for a man to deal with it. "I believe you're right," he said. "You'll want to check the hoof for a lodged stone before you let him rest on it," Clara said. "If there's still something in there and he bears weight on it overnight, you'll have a worse problem by morning." "I did check it on the road," he said. "I didn't find anything lodged, but I might have missed it in the low light." "Come around to the barn," Clara said. She took her apron off and hung it on the peg by the door. "I'll get a lamp." Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that could have stopped a stampede. "Clara, his horse is lame, Mama. I'm going to help him look at the hoof. You are not going to the barn alone with a stranger." "Then come with me," Clara said pleasantly, and walked to the barn with the lamp before her mother could organize a proper objection. The man followed her, leading the bay carefully. In the yellow lamplight the horse was a handsome animal, dark red with a black mane, and Clara could see that he was well cared for, his coat brushed, his hooves recently trimmed. "What's his name?" she asked, setting the lamp on the hook above the nearest stall. "Harlan," the man said. Then, as if he'd forgotten something essential, he added, "I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jesse Cade. I'm a cattle drover out of Abilene, heading north to meet a herd outside of Hays City." "Clara Whitfield," she said. She crouched down next to Harlan's right foreleg and ran her hands along the cannon bone first, then down to the pastern. The horse flinched slightly when she reached the coronet band. "Light sensitive here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She carefully lifted the hoof and turned it toward the light, and there, wedged into the white line near the toe, was a sliver of dark stone no bigger than a thumbnail, but sharp-edged and buried deep enough to press with every step. "There," she said. "Do you have a hoof pick?" Jesse was already reaching into his saddlebag. He handed her the pick without comment, which she appreciated. Some men would have insisted on doing it themselves to avoid the embarrassment of being shown up by a woman. He simply crouched beside her and held the lamp closer so she had better light. She worked the stone out carefully, talking quietly to Harlan all the while, and the horse stood with unexpected patience. The stone came free with a soft scraping sound, and Jesse let out a slow breath. "There you go," Clara said, setting the hoof down gently. She straightened and handed him the hoof pick back. "He'll need to rest that foot for at least a day, maybe two. If you push him tomorrow, you'll lame him properly." Jesse looked at the small stone in his palm, then at the horse, then at Clara. "I appreciate it," he said, and his voice had gone quieter than before. I truly do. You're welcome to the stall for the night, Clara said, because the words came out before she considered them, but once they were out she didn't take them back. There's a cot in the tack room if you want it. It's not comfortable, but it's better than the ground. You don't have to do that, Miss Whitfield. I know I don't, she said. I'm doing it anyway. She walked back to the house with the lamp, and her mother was standing on the porch with both arms crossed and her lips so tightly pressed together they had nearly disappeared. He'll need to rest his horse overnight, Clara said. Sleeping in the tack room. Clara Whitfield, Edith began. His horse has a stone bruise, Mama. He can't ride on. I gave him the tack room. It's the charitable thing to do. Her mother looked at her for a long moment with the look she had perfected over 32 years, the look that said she saw through every excuse Clara had ever offered. But she also, apparently, didn't have a compelling counterargument against Christian charity, and so she went inside and Clara went back to the stew. The stew needed another 20 minutes. Clara stirred it and thought about the man in the barn with his quiet eyes and the way he had crouched beside her in the lamplight without making it a contest, and something in her chest that had been bent all afternoon straightened itself just a fraction. She ladled 2 bowls of stew, cut 4 slices of bread, and poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She put it all on a tray. Her mother watched this from the corner of her eye. "You are not taking supper to that man. He's a guest," Clara said. "We feed our guests." She carried the tray out to the barn. Jesse was in the stall with Harlan, running his hands along the horse's shoulder with the gentle, automatic touch of a man who had spent a great portion of his life in the company of horses. He looked up when she came in. "I brought you something to eat," she said. "The tack room has a small table. You can take it in there." He looked at the tray, then at her, and his expression shifted into something she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise exactly, but something softer. "That's very kind of you," he said. "Will you tell me how to repay you? I have coin." "I don't want coin," Clara said. "Just eat before it gets cold." She was not planning to stay. She had brought the tray, and she was going to set it on the table in the tack room and go back to the house and have her own supper and not think anything more about Jesse Cade and his quiet eyes and his carefully held hat. That was the plan. But he said, "Will you sit for a minute?" And the question was so plainly, honestly meant that she sat down on the bench along the tack room wall while he settled onto the 3-legged stool across from the table and lifted the spoon. He ate the stew like a man who had been eating trail food for weeks and had almost forgotten what something warm and seasoned tasted like. He didn't say anything for the first few minutes, and Clara didn't feel the need to fill the silence. She had always been more comfortable with silence than with noise. After a time, he said, "This is the best thing I have eaten since February." "What happened in February?" The corner of his mouth turned up. "A widow woman outside of Wichita made me a lamb stew. I've been measuring things against it ever since." "And how does mine compare?" "Yours wins," he said, without any trace of flattery. He said it the way he might report the weather, a simple observation of fact, and Clara felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the stove. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "Grew up outside of Independence. My father had a small farm there." He paused. "I left when I was 18. Went south first, worked cattle in Texas for about 10 years, then started moving north with the drives. I've been on the trail most of my adult life." "Do you like it?" He considered this, which she found interesting. Most men would have answered immediately, because the expected answer was yes, of course. What man wouldn't like the freedom of the open trail? Jesse Cade took a moment to actually think about the question. "I like some parts of it," he said finally. "I like the open country, and I like working with horses and cattle. I like the men I've ridden with, most of them anyway. But I've been doing it for a long time, and lately I find myself thinking more about what I'd want instead." "What would you want instead?" Clara asked, and she meant it as a conversational question, but it came out more direct than she intended, and she saw something in his face shift, a kind of honest openness that was unusual in a man who was still essentially a stranger. "Something steady," he said. "Something with roots in it." He looked at his bowl, then back at her. "I'm 36 years old, Miss Whitfield. I've been moving since I was 18. I think I'd like to stop moving." The tack room was warm and smelled of saddle leather and hay, and the lamplight was soft and gold between them, and Clara sat very still for a moment, aware of the oddness of the conversation, aware of how little she knew this man, aware also that she had not spoken this easily and honestly with anyone in longer than she cared to remember. "My mother said this evening that I am too old to be loved," she said, and she was not sure why she said it, except that the words had been sitting in her chest all afternoon, and the barn seemed like a safe enough place to set them down. Jesse went very still. He looked at her with an expression that was not pity, which was what she had been bracing for. It was something more like indignation, quiet and controlled but genuine. "How old are you?" he asked. 32. He shook his head slowly, and there was something almost rueful in it. "That's a hard thing for a mother to say to her daughter." "She means well," Clara said, which was true, and she believed it, even if believing it didn't make the words land any softer. "I expect she does," Jesse said, "but she's wrong." The words settled into the room quietly, without fanfare, without particular drama. Just two words dropped into the silence between them. "She is wrong." Clara looked at him, and he was looking back at her with no particular self-consciousness about what he had just said, as if it were simply a corrected fact, a mistake noted and addressed. "You don't know me," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "But I know enough to know that age has nothing to do with being worthy of love. And I know enough to know that a woman who walks out to a cold barn with a lamp to help a stranger's lame horse and brings him supper without being asked is a woman with something very real in her." Clara looked away first. She looked at the wall of hanging bridles, and she breathed carefully. "Eat the rest of your stew," she said. "It'll go cold." He smiled, and she didn't see it directly, but she felt it, the way you feel warmth from a fire even when you're not looking at it. He ate the rest of the stew. When she left the barn with the empty tray, the Kansas sky was enormous and black and salted with stars, and the wind was low and carrying the smell of something green from the south, the first real smell of spring. And Clara stood in the yard for a moment with the tray under her arm and looked up at all those stars and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the world might be larger than she had recently been led to believe. She went inside and had her own supper alone at the kitchen table, because her mother had gone to bed early with the righteousness of a woman who has said her piece, and Thomas was not home from town yet, and it was just Clara and the lamp and the quiet ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. She slept well, which surprised her. In the morning, she was up before dawn, which was her habit, and she started the fire in the stove and put water on for coffee and mixed the batter for cornbread. The barn was quiet when she looked out the window. A soft gray light was beginning to come up in the east. She heard the barn door when the light was still low, and then boots on the porch steps, and she opened the kitchen door before he could knock. Jesse Cade had his hat in his hands again. He had his saddlebags over one shoulder and the look of a man who had slept reasonably but was carrying the early morning in him still. "How is Harlan?" she asked. "Tender still," he said. "I walked him out slowly and checked his movement. He's better, but you were right. He shouldn't carry weight today." Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in. Coffee is nearly ready and the cornbread will be done in a few minutes." "I don't want to put you out any further," he said. "You're not putting me out," she said. "I'm cooking breakfast regardless. Come in." He came in, and he sat at the kitchen table in the chair Thomas usually occupied when Thomas bothered to come home, and he looked around the kitchen with the quiet attention of a man who is noticing a place rather than just occupying it. He noticed the herbs she had drying in bunches from the ceiling beam. He noticed the row of preserves on the shelf above the window, the dark red of wild plum and the golden amber of crabapple. He noticed the small stack of books on the corner shelf, which most people didn't notice. "You read a lot?" he asked. "When I can," she said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set his in front of him. "There's not always time, but I try. What do you read?" "Novels mostly," she said. "History when I can find it. I've been trying to get through a geography of the Western Territories, but it's not exactly a page-turner." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, unself-conscious and warm. My mother read to me when I was small, he said. I never got into the habit of it myself. I sometimes think I missed something. You can always start, Clara said. I suppose you can, he said, and looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. Her mother came downstairs at 6:30, and to her credit, Edith Whitfield did not make a scene at finding a strange man at her kitchen table. She simply drew herself up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and said good morning with the minimal warmth that courtesy required and no more, and poured her own coffee and sat at the far end of the table with the posture of a woman maintaining a protest through silence. Jesse thanked her for the use of the barn. Edith said it was nothing, in a tone that implied it was considerably something. Clara brought the cornbread from the oven and sliced it and put butter and honey on the table, and for a while the only sounds were the clink of cutlery and the wind in the eaves and the distant crow of the neighbor's rooster. Mr. Cade, Edith said eventually, because silence was only a strategy for so long and Edith Whitfield had never been a patient general. Where are you headed? Hayes City, Jesse said. I'm supposed to meet a herd there and drive it up to a buyer in Nebraska. And after that, Jesse looked at her steadily. I'm not sure yet, he said. I've been thinking about that. Edith looked at him the way she looked at men who came to her door selling things, with the particular sharpness of someone assessing whether the goods on offer matched the price being asked. Whatever she concluded, she kept it to herself and returned to her cornbread. After breakfast, Jesse helped Clara carry water from the pump to the trough, and they worked side by side in the cool morning air without making a particular effort to talk, and found that the silence between them was easy, which was unusual enough to be significant. I need to stay another day, he said, when the trough was full and they were both standing in the yard with the empty buckets. Harlan won't be ready to travel until tomorrow at the earliest. I know that's an imposition, and I'll pay you whatever you ask for the trouble. It's not trouble, Clara said. There's work enough here if you want to earn your keep. The north fence has 2 broken posts that Thomas was supposed to fix 2 weeks ago. His eyes brightened slightly at this, the genuine pleasure of a man offered useful work. I can fix a fence, he said. Then fix it, she said. He fixed the fence. He spent the better part of the morning on it, and Clara watched him from the vegetable garden where she was breaking the first soil of the season, turning it with the heavy spade her father had brought from Ohio, and she watched the way Jesse worked, methodically and efficiently, and without any of the theatrical suffering that Thomas brought to manual labor. He simply did the work with focused, steady hands, and when he was done he walked the fence line and checked each post and came back looking satisfied. She brought him water and he drank it and handed the cup back and said, Your brother's been leaving this place to fall apart. He has, Clara agreed. He lives here, when it suits him. He's 17 and he's found Dodge City more interesting than 40 acres of pasture. Jesse looked at the fence he'd mended, then at the barn, which also needed some attention, and at the house, where 2 window shutters were hanging crooked. It's a lot for 2 women to manage alone, he said. It is, Clara said simply, but we manage it. He looked at her then with something she couldn't quite decode, something that was partly admiration and partly something more complicated, something that was turning over and considering and arriving at conclusions she wasn't yet privy to. In the afternoon he fixed the shutters, because she didn't ask him to, but he saw them and went and got the tools from the barn without comment. And then he oiled the hinges on the barn door that had been shrieking all winter, and Clara found herself making excuses to be near the barn, which she was honest enough with herself to recognize for what it was. Louisa came by in the late afternoon, riding the mild-tempered bay mare her husband kept for her, and she came into the kitchen and looked around and said, Mama's note said there is a man staying here. His horse is lame, Clara said. He's mending it in the barn. Louisa looked out the kitchen window to where Jesse was in the yard with Harlan, walking the horse slowly in a circle to test his movement. He's very tall, Louisa observed. Yes, and handsome. Louisa. I'm just making observations, Louisa said. with the particular innocence of someone who is making something much more pointed than mere observations. She helped herself to tea and settled into the chair by the window from which she could most conveniently continue her observations. "Has Mama spoken to him? This morning at breakfast. How did that go?" "About as well as you'd expect." Louisa sipped her tea. "He looks at you," she said. "When you were walking across the yard just now, he looked at you. He was looking at the horse." "Clara, I have been married 3 years, and I know the difference between a man looking at a horse and a man looking at a woman." Clara sat down across from her sister. "He'll be gone tomorrow," she said. Louisa looked at her with her soft brown eyes and didn't say anything, which was somehow more eloquent than anything she might have said. Supper that night was a more elaborate affair than Clara had originally planned, which she told herself was because she had more ingredients than usual and not for any other reason. She made a proper roast chicken with the herbs from her garden, and roasted potatoes with onion, and baked 2 pies from the dried apple and cinnamon she kept in the pantry. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. Her mother set the table with the good plates, which Clara noticed and said nothing about. Thomas appeared at 5:30, which was the most punctual he had been in months, and he came through the door smelling of tobacco and with the particular careful-footed walk of someone who had been drinking but was working hard to hide it. He stopped when he saw Jesse sitting at the kitchen table. "Who are you?" Thomas said. "Jesse Cade. My horse went lame on the road. Your sisters were kind enough to let me shelter for a night or 2. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him steadily. Thomas was tall for 17, with their father's dark hair and their mother's stubborn chin, and he had the look of a young man who was in the active process of making himself into someone his family wouldn't recognize. But he wasn't bad, not at his core. He was just 17 and lost, and there was nobody to anchor him. "You know horses?" Thomas asked Jesse. "Well enough," Jesse said. "Maybe you can look at our mare," Thomas said, dropping into the remaining chair and pulling it close to the table with the boneless ease of youth. "She's been off her feed." "I can look," Jesse said. They went to the barn before supper, the 2 of them, and Clara watched from the kitchen window. She could see them moving around the mare's stall, Jesse crouching to look at the animal's legs, Thomas asking questions she couldn't hear, and something shifted in Thomas's posture. The defensive hunch of his shoulders relaxing into something more open, something younger and more genuine. She brought them in for supper at 6 o'clock, and the table was full in a way it hadn't been in years, all 4 of them. And the food was good, and the lamp was warm, and Jesse Cade sat across from Clara, and ate with the same serious appreciation he'd brought to the stew the night before. And when he told her mother that the apple pie was extraordinary, Edith Whitfield's expression did something it very rarely did. It softened. "You need to prune your apple trees earlier in the season," Edith told him, as if he had apple trees, and Jesse listened with perfect attentiveness and said he would keep that in mind. Thomas was asking Jesse about cattle drives, leaning forward with his elbows on the table in a way his mother would normally have corrected, and Jesse was talking about the trail between Texas and Kansas with the ease of someone who has lived a story rather than just telling one. Clara found herself listening too, not to the content exactly, but to the quality of his voice, the way it never overstated, never performed, just laid things out honestly. "Did you ever see a fight?" Thomas asked, with the transparent hunger of a 17-year-old. "A few," Jesse said. "On the trail you see disputes over cattle and water and card games, and all sorts of things men find to argue about when they're tired and far from home. But I'll tell you something, Thomas. The men I respected most on every drive I was ever part of were the ones who had the most self-control, not the ones who were quickest to a confrontation. The men who resolved things with their heads were the ones still standing at the end of it." Thomas considered this with the particular seriousness of a young man who is being told something he hasn't heard before, or at least hasn't heard from someone he was inclined to believe. Clara watched Jesse say this and felt something move through her that was warmer and deeper than admiration. She felt something that was, if she was being honest with herself in the warm and honest light of the kitchen lamp, the beginning of falling. After supper, Edith and Thomas went inside to the sitting room, and Jesse carried the plates to the kitchen without being asked, and Clara was at the basin washing up when she realized he was beside her, drying the dishes she handed to him, and they were working together in the close, warm space of the kitchen in the lamplight, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said, "Clara." She looked at him. She had been Clara to him for most of the day. She'd corrected the Miss Whitfield early on, but the way he said it now was different. It was not a form of address. It was a deliberate saying of her name, like he was placing it somewhere specific. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am entirely serious and not saying it for any reason other than that I mean it." She turned to face him, and the basin of soapy water was between them, and the lamp was casting everything gold, and she waited. "I know it is very soon," he said. "I know I arrived here yesterday evening, and we have had one supper together and one breakfast, and I have spent 2 days on your property, and by any reasonable accounting of things that is nowhere near enough time to say something like what I am about to say." He paused. He was looking at her steadily, and his hands were still holding the dish towel, and he was not nervous exactly, but he was very deliberate, the way a man is deliberate when he is making sure the words he uses are the exact right ones. "I have been on the road for 18 years. I have met a great many people, and I can tell you honestly that I have not felt in all those years the way I have felt in the last 2 days. There is something about you that feels like the answer to a question I didn't know I was asking." Clara's hands were still in the basin. The water had gone lukewarm. "I am asking if I may court you, Clara," he said. "Properly. I understand I am a stranger, and I understand that you have no reason yet to trust me, and I am not asking you to trust me yet. I am asking for the chance to give you reason to." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with his weathered face and his careful words, and his way of crouching in the barn lamplight beside her without making it a contest. "My family says I am too old to be loved," she said quietly. "Your family is wrong," he said, just as quietly, and with exactly the same certainty he had said it the night before. Something inside Clara that had been holding very tight, something that had been braced and compressed and rigid under the weight of 32 years of practicality and her mother's words, and the ordinary accumulation of a life spent waiting for the world to be larger, let go. "You need to stay until your horse is fully recovered," she said, which was not a yes but was the direction of yes, and from the way his face changed, she could see that he understood this perfectly. "Of course," he said. Harlan needed 3 more days, as it turned out, because on the morning Jesse had planned to ride out, Clara inspected the hoof again and said the bruising was still tender and another day's rest would serve him better, and Jesse agreed without argument. By this point Thomas had taken to following Jesse around the property in the mornings, asking questions with the frank curiosity he normally kept wrapped in teenage indifference, and Edith had twice offered Jesse an extra piece of pie, which from Edith was more or less a declaration of war ended and a peace settlement signed. On the evening of the second extra day, when the sky had gone that particular deep indigo that came just before the stars appeared, Clara and Jesse sat on the porch steps because the kitchen was warm and Thomas was inside, and there was no other reason she could point to, and they talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say. He told her about Missouri and about Texas, and about a drive through a flash flood in 1871, where he had lost 3 cattle and nearly lost his horse and himself. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, which he said had the particular quality of being surrounded by men and still feeling entirely alone, because none of them were the kind of company he was looking for. He told her about a stretch of country he had ridden through in the Colorado Territory that was so beautiful it had made him feel something close to grief, because he had no one to show it to. She told him about her father, about Elias Whitfield, who had been a quiet man with large ideas and small means, who had loved books and the names of plants, and had taught Clara to identify the stars before she could properly read. She told him about the years after her father died, about learning the farm by necessity rather than by choice, about the strange pride she had discovered in herself through the act of keeping things alive. She told him that she had not particularly wanted to be a farmer's daughter, that she had wanted, as a young woman, to see things, to go places, to understand what was beyond the horizon, and that she had stayed instead and made something of the staying, but that the wanting had never entirely gone away. "What did you want to see?" he asked. "The mountains," she said. "I've read about them, the Rockies. I've looked at maps and read descriptions, and I've tried to imagine it, but I can't quite get there. You can't imagine something from a map, you have to see it." "I've seen them," Jesse said, and his voice was reverent in a way that did not surprise her. "What are they like?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie, and then he said, "Like something that existed before language. Like something you can look at but can't quite put into any word that does it justice. The first time I saw them, I was 23, and I pulled my horse up and just sat there for I don't know how long, because I didn't know what else to do." Clara looked at the prairie and at the stars and at the dark horizon, and she said, "I would like to see them someday." "I'd like to take you," Jesse said. She looked at him. "I mean that," he said, "not as a figure of speech." The night insects were singing in the grass, and far off a dog was barking at something in the dark, and the Kansas sky was enormous and close, and Clara sat very still next to Jesse Cade on the porch steps and felt the world expanding in her chest like bread rising, slow and warm and inevitable. On the morning of the third extra day, the sun came up clear and warm, and Jesse walked Harlan in the yard again and then rode him slowly up the road and back, and the horse moved well, evenly, without favoring the foot. He came and told Clara, and his face was complicated, the honest pleasure of a recovered horse set against something else that she understood without being told. "When do you need to be in Hayes City?" she asked. "I've got 4 more days," he said. "But it's 2 days' ride from here in easy conditions. I need to leave tomorrow morning." She nodded. She had known it was coming. "Will you come back?" she asked. "The drive will take about 6 weeks," he said. "Nebraska and back. And then I want to come back here if you'll have me." "You don't know where you'll be after Nebraska," she said, not unkindly but honestly. "I know where I want to be," he said. There was a space between those two statements, and in that space was everything that had been building for 5 days, all the conversations and the shared work and the lamplit suppers and the porch steps and the 2 hours of talking in the dark. And Clara stood in that space and looked at Jesse Cade and made a decision. "Then come back," she said. "I'll be here." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time they had touched deliberately, and his hand was large and calloused and warm, and he held her hand the way you hold something you are being careful with, firmly but gently. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In the afternoon before he was due to leave, Thomas pulled Clara aside in the kitchen and said, in the rushed, low voice of someone who has been building up to a thing, "He's a good man, Clara. I can tell." She looked at her brother, at his young face with the shadow of stubble on it and the dark eyes that were their father's eyes, and she said, "I know. You should let him come back," Thomas said. "I already did," she said. Thomas blinked, surprised by this. Then he grinned, the real grin, the one underneath all the teenage armor, and he looked for a moment exactly like the boy he still was, and not the reckless stranger he'd been trying to become. "Good," he said. That evening, her mother found Clara in the garden at twilight, checking the stakes on the bean plants she had put in that week. Edith stood at the garden's edge with her shawl around her shoulders and her expression doing something difficult, the expression of a woman who is arriving somewhere she didn't expect. "He is not what I would have chosen for you," Edith said. Clara waited. "He is a drover. He has no land, no settled place. He is 36 years old and still moving." "He says he wants to stop moving," Clara said. "Men say many things." "Some men mean them," Clara said. Edith looked at her daughter in the thin twilight, at the woman Clara had become, the woman who could read a horse's hoof in lamplight and mend a fence and make a stew from almost nothing and run a farm on her own and still have fire enough left to want something more. Edith looked at her, and for once she didn't look through her, she looked at her. "He looked at you," Edith said finally. "At supper. He looked at you the way your father looked at me." Clara felt something catch in her throat. "Your father was not what I would have chosen either," Edith said. "He had too many ideas and not enough money, and he wanted to go to Kansas when everyone else was staying in Ohio." She paused. "But he looked at me like that." She turned and went back inside, and Clara stood in the garden in the growing dark and breathed slowly and felt something vast and gentle settle around her shoulders like a shawl. Jesse rode out the next morning before the sun was fully up, with Harlan moving easily and his saddlebags packed, and his hat settled firm against the early wind. He stopped at the gate and turned the horse back toward the house, and Clara was standing on the porch in her work dress with her hair still loose because she'd come out before finishing it. He touched the brim of his hat. "6 weeks," he said. "6 weeks," she said. He rode north, and Clara watched him go until the road turned and the distance took him, and then she went inside and put her hair up and started the day's work. The 6 weeks that followed were both longer and shorter than she expected. Longer because she had become aware of an absence she hadn't felt before he arrived. Shorter because she was busy, because there was always work to be done on the farm, and because Thomas, apparently galvanized by something Jesse had said or simply by having had someone treat him like a person worth taking seriously, had started coming home regularly and doing the work he was supposed to do. He fixed the sagging gate. He cleaned out the old feed in the barn and replaced it. He started getting up before 6 o'clock. One Sunday in May, Louisa came for dinner and they sat in the parlor after the meal, just the two sisters, and Louisa said, "You're different." "Am I?" "You have been different since he left," Louisa said. She wasn't saying it critically, just observationally. "You're quieter, but not in the unhappy way, more like you're waiting for something." "I am waiting for something," Clara said. Louisa smiled, her soft peach-cheeked smile. "Good," she said. "I'm glad for you. I always thought you deserved more than this place." "I love this place," Clara said. "I know you do. I mean more than just this place." Clara wrote a letter which she wasn't sure she'd send, but she wrote it anyway. She addressed it to Jesse Cade in care of the Cattlemen's Exchange in Hayes City, and she wrote 3 pages about the farm and the spring and the bean plants and what Thomas had been doing, and a passage about the mountains that she'd read in the geography book and what she'd thought of it. And at the end, she wrote simply, "I find I am looking forward to when you return more than I expected, and I wanted you to know that." She sent it. 5 days later, she received a letter, which told her he had sent his own letter the same day she had sent hers. His was 4 pages, the handwriting large and slightly irregular, the kind of handwriting of a man who is more comfortable on horseback than at a desk, but the sentences were clear and honest. He wrote about the trail and the country and a thunderstorm that had scattered part of the herd and cost him 2 days. He wrote about a town in Nebraska he'd passed through that had a bookshop that had made him think of her. He said he had gone in and bought a book, which he had not done in years, and that he would bring it when he came. At the end he wrote, "I don't usually write letters. I find that with you I have things I want to say and cannot wait to say them in person." Clara read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in the drawer of her bureau where she kept the things she wanted to keep. He came back in the last week of May, which was earlier than 6 weeks, and she asked him about that later, and he said he had pushed a little harder in the final stretch. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and she was in the kitchen making bread, her hands deep in the dough, when she heard Harlan in the yard. She went to the door and he was dismounting at the gate, and he looked up and saw her, and the expression on his face did the same thing his voice had done that night on the porch. It said her name without saying it. She wiped her hands on her apron and went down the steps. "You're early," she said. "I am," he said. "How's Harlan?" "Perfect," he said, "strong as ever." They stood in the yard for a moment in the Saturday afternoon light, and then he said, I brought you the book and reached into the saddlebag. It was a slim volume, its cover slightly worn from travel, and he handed it to her and she looked at it. It was a collection of essays about the Western Territories, written by a man who had traveled extensively through the Colorado and Wyoming regions. There were descriptions of the mountains that were so detailed and specific they were almost like being there. "This is remarkable," she said. "I thought you'd think so," he said. She looked up at him. He was dusty from the road and there was a cut on his chin that was almost healed, and he was looking at her with those quiet dark eyes, and she thought that whatever she had been expecting the last 6 weeks was nothing compared to actually having him here in the yard, close enough to touch. "Come inside," she said. "I'll start some coffee." He came inside and he stayed. Not all at once, not without the proper formality, because Clara was 32 and had her mother's practicality in her, even if she disagreed with her mother's conclusions. Jesse asked formally if he could call on Clara, and he said this to Edith Whitfield directly and without embarrassment, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands in the way he had on the first night. And Edith looked at him for a long, hard moment and said that she supposed there was no harm in it. He called on her 3 times a week through June and into July, riding out from the rooms he was renting in Dodge City, sometimes arriving in the evening for supper and staying to sit on the porch until the dark came fully down, sometimes arriving in the morning and spending the day helping with the farm work before the formal sitting on the porch part of the visit commenced. He was looking for land, he told her. He had money saved, more than she expected, because a man who had been on the trail for 18 years and had no fixed expenses and no vices beyond the occasional tobacco had managed to accumulate something. He found 40 acres 6 miles south of the Whitfield property, along a creek that ran clear and strong and had good willows along the bank. The land was priced fairly because the previous owner had moved to California with his family, and there was a small but solid house on it, 2 rooms and a covered porch, and a barn that needed work but had good bones. He showed her the property on a Wednesday afternoon in July, and they rode out together on Harlan and her father's old saddle horse, and she walked through the small house with its plain walls and empty fireplace and stood in the kitchen doorway looking out the back window at the creek and the willows and the gentle rise of the land toward the south. "What do you think?" he asked from the doorway. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe in the afternoon light, watching her move through the space with the careful attention she gave to everything, and she could see that he was not asking her to assess the property. He was asking something larger. "It needs a lot of work," she said. "It does," he agreed. "The porch boards need replacing." "They do. The kitchen needs a proper stove." "It does." She looked at him across the empty room. "Are you asking me what I think of the house?" she said. "Or are you asking me what I think of living in it?" He crossed the room to her in 3 slow steps and stopped close enough that she could see the line of his jaw in the afternoon light, and he said, "I'm asking you what you think of living in it with me." Her heart was doing something complicated and large. "I'm asking you to marry me, Clara," he said quietly. "I know it's been 2 months, and I know that is not a very long time by anyone's counting. But I also know that I spent 18 years on the road, and I know the difference between feeling temporary and feeling like the right place to stop. You are where I want to stop." She looked at him. She looked at his face, at the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the open sun, at the honest set of his mouth, at those dark, steady eyes that had never once in 2 months given her anything except the straightforward truth of what he was thinking. "My family says I am too old to be loved," she said, for the last time. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving them wrong," he said. She took a breath. She looked out the window at the willows along the creek and the green of the summer land and the wide Kansas sky, and she thought about her father who had brought her mother to Kansas against all advice and given her 30 years of being looked at like she was the most important sight on the horizon, and she turned back to Jesse Cade and said, "Yes." He took both her hands, and the warmth of them moved all the way up her arms. They rode back to the Whitfield homestead in the late afternoon, and the supper was already started, and Clara went into the kitchen and stood next to her mother at the stove and said, "Jesse has asked me to marry him. I've said yes." Edith went very still with the wooden spoon in her hand. Then she set it down on the stove ledge carefully and turned to look at her daughter. "Are you happy?" Edith asked. And it was not a practical question, it was not a logistical question, it was the question underneath all the other questions her mother had ever asked her, the one that had been there all along underneath the practicality. "Yes, Mama," Clara said. "I am very happy." Edith reached out and took Clara's face in both her rough hands, the way she hadn't done since Clara was very small, and she looked at her, and whatever she saw was enough, because she let out a breath that seemed to carry something old and heavy with it, and she said, "Good. Then I will not object." And that was that. Jesse came into the kitchen a moment later, after waiting a respectful amount of time on the porch, and Edith told him that she expected he would take good care of her daughter, and he said that he intended to, and she said she would hold him to that, and he said she was welcome too. Thomas, when he heard, punched Jesse on the arm in the exuberant, slightly too hard way of a 17-year-old who doesn't quite know what to do with his feelings, and then pumped his hand vigorously and said, "You're going to be my brother," with a kind of startled delight, as if the idea had just occurred to him and he found it entirely acceptable. Louisa cried, which was expected, and her husband George shook Jesse's hand with the measured assessment of a cattleman looking at a good piece of stock, and concluded, apparently, that the stock was sound. They were married in September, 6 months after Jesse had stopped in the Whitfield yard with a lame horse and a hat in his hands, in the small church in Dodge City that served the surrounding homesteads. The minister was a compact man named Reverend Cross, who had married a great many frontier couples and had learned to keep his sermons practical. The church was full, not because Jesse and Clara had a large social circle, but because in a community of scattered homesteads any gathering was an occasion, and people came from 20 miles in every direction. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from blue-gray wool broadcloth, because she was practical enough not to spend money on silk, and because the blue-gray matched her eyes in a way she privately noted. She put field flowers from along the creek in her hair, small white ones whose names she knew because her father had taught her, and she carried a single stem of wild columbine because she had always loved the impractical shape of it. Jesse wore his best coat, which he had purchased in Dodge City the week before, and had clearly made a very deliberate effort with his hair. He was standing at the front of the church when she came in, and when he saw her, his face did the thing it always did, the thing that was worth more to her than any number of silk dresses or elaborate arrangements, the thing that said she was the most important sight on the horizon. She walked up the aisle next to Thomas, who was trying very hard to hold himself together and mostly succeeding, and she stood next to Jesse Cade and said what she meant and meant what she said, and he looked at her the whole time the way her father had looked at her mother, and she thought of Edith saying that, on the porch in the twilight, and felt the whole long thread of things connect from past to present. They went home to the Creek property after the reception at the church hall, where Edith had brought 3 pies and Louisa had brought flowers, and Thomas had eaten rather too much of everything and been entirely happy. The little house had been transformed in the 2 months since Jesse had bought it. The porch boards were new. The kitchen had a proper iron cookstove, a good one that Jesse had brought up from Wichita on the wagon. The walls had been painted white inside, and Clara had made curtains from the calico she'd found in the dry goods store in Dodge City, a pattern of small blue flowers on cream, and they moved in the evening breeze through the open windows. She stood in the kitchen of their house on the first night of their marriage and looked at the new stove and the curtains and the shelf, where she had already arranged her books, the geography of the Western Territories and the volume of essays Jesse had brought her from Nebraska, and the novels she'd had for years, and she felt the quiet, extraordinary rightness of things. Jesse came in from seeing to Harlan in the newly repaired barn, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her in the lamplight, and she turned and looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, with the small smile that was entirely his own. "Are you going to stand in the doorway all evening?" "I might," he said. "I like the view from here." She felt warmth rise in her, bright and uncomplicated. "Come in, Jesse," she said. "This is your home." He came in. The first winter in the Creek house was a good one. Not easy, because a Kansas winter on 40 acres of land you are newly responsible for is never exactly easy, but good in the deep-running sense of the word, the way good things are when they have been arrived at through real effort and real wanting. They develop the habits of people who are genuinely well-suited to each other. Jesse rose early and went to the barn, and Clara rose a few minutes behind him and started the kitchen fire and the coffee. And by the time he came in from the morning check on the animals, there was warmth and light and something on the stove, and this routine settled around them like a coat that had been made to measure. He was good at the physical work, stronger and more experienced with animals than she had guessed even from the start, and he was learning the land in the methodical way he did everything, writing its boundaries and mapping its resources in his head. He decided in November to acquire 4 cattle, which he bought from a rancher south of Dodge, and he talked through the decision with Clara first, sitting at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper where he had worked out the costs and the likely returns, and she looked at the numbers and said that she thought it was sound, and offered a modification to the timing of it that he agreed was better, and they shook hands over the table and he laughed, which was a good laugh, and she laughed too. They went to the Whitfield homestead every Sunday. Thomas was changing, slowly and not always in a straight line, but changing toward something better, and Jesse took him out to help with the cattle whenever Thomas was available, treating him not as a boy to be managed but as a young man learning a trade, and the effect on Thomas was remarkable and gradual and real. In December, Jesse built shelves in the bedroom for Clara's books. He measured them carefully and cut the wood himself and finished them smooth, and when she ran her hand along the finished wood she said, "These are beautiful," and he said, "You take care of them," meaning the books, but she thought he might have meant her and she was right, and she let it be both. In the evenings, when the work was done and the cattle were settled and the house was warm, they sat together by the fire, Clara reading and Jesse doing the accounts or mending tack, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the cattle and the weather and what Thomas had done that week, and what Louisa had said when she came visiting, and about larger things too, the country and the times and what they believed about how things should be. Jesse had opinions about the treatment of the native peoples of the plains that were not common among the men of his acquaintance. He had ridden through enough of the country and seen enough of what had happened to it to have formed conclusions that were uncomfortable but honest, and he stated them quietly and without apology, that the dispossession of the tribes that had lived on these plains for generations was a wrong that would take generations to reckon with, that the promises made and broken by the government were a kind of slow violence that deserved to be named as what it was. Clara listened and agreed, because she had read enough and thought enough to have arrived at similar conclusions through different routes, and they were 2 people who had both looked at the injustice and declined to look away from it. They were not people who could fix what had been broken in the world, but they were people who could be honest about it, and that honesty between them was part of what made the evening firelight feel like something worth staying near. In the early spring of 1879, Clara told Jesse that she was expecting, and he received this news by putting down the tack he was mending very carefully, as if it were suddenly fragile, and looking at her for a long still moment with an expression that was not something she could name, because it was too many things at once, joy and gravity and tenderness, and the particular sobriety of a man who understands the weight of what has just been entrusted to him. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. "Come here," he said, and she came, and he held her in both arms with the same care he used for everything he cared about, the careful, firm gentleness that was entirely characteristic of him. And they stood in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the blue-flowered curtains and held onto each other in the good way, the way that is about more than the moment. He told her that evening that he wanted to build another room onto the house, and they sat at the kitchen table with the paper and the figures as they had done before. And it was a good plan, and Clara added her modifications to the timing and the materials, and they shook hands over it again. And this time he didn't laugh because his face was too full for laughing, but he pressed his hand over hers on the paper and held it there for a moment before he let go. The room was built by August, in the hot Kansas summer, with Thomas helping on the weekends because he had become the kind of young man who helped. And George Holt from down the road came 2 Saturdays in a row because he was a better carpenter than anyone had expected and seemed glad of the excuse. Jesse had designed the room with a good south-facing window and enough space for a proper crib and a rocking chair, and Clara sewed the curtains for it herself, a different pattern from the kitchen curtains, softer, pale yellow with small birds on it. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold morning with a hard wind blowing off the prairie, and the midwife from Dodge City had arrived the night before and stayed, and Jesse was in the house the whole time in a state of carefully maintained composure that Clara could see right through. When the baby's first cry filled the house, she heard Jesse in the kitchen make a sound she had never heard from him before, a short, rough exhale that was also something else, something she understood without hearing it directly. They named him Elias for Clara's father. Jesse held him for the first time in the afternoon, sitting in the rocking chair Clara had placed in the new room, and he held the infant with enormous careful hands, and looked at his son's red crumpled face with the same expression he had worn when she had told him the news. She watched him from the bed, still tired, still new to the feeling of the weight lifted and the weight given, and she thought that this was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "Hello, Elias," Jesse said very quietly to the baby in his arms. "I am your father. I have been moving for a very long time, and you are one of the main reasons I have stopped." Edith Whitfield appeared at the farm 2 days later with 3 pies, a pot of soup, and a quantity of practical baby advice, and she held the baby with the competence of a woman who has done this before and the particular softness of a grandmother, which was a softness Clara had not previously seen in her mother's face and was moved to discover was there. "He has your father's nose," Edith told Clara. "I think he has Jesse's jaw," Clara said. "He can have both," Edith said, and looked at the baby in her arms, and her face was entirely unguarded in a way it so rarely was, and Clara felt something old and knotted between them come loose. Louisa came the same afternoon, and she cried, which was also expected, and she held Elias and looked at him with the longing that Clara recognized as the specific longing of a woman who has not yet managed to have a baby of her own, and Clara reached out and took Louis's hand and held it until the longing settled. "Your turn will come," Clara said. "Do you think so?" Louisa said. "I do," Clara said firmly, with the confidence of a woman who has recently received proof that the world is wider and more generous than previously advertised. Thomas, at 18 and trying to present himself as a man of the world, looked at the baby and was clearly undone by it despite his best efforts. He held Elias awkwardly for about 30 seconds and then handed him back with tremendous relief, but he sat by Clara's bed for an hour afterward and talked to her about what he was thinking about doing with his life, because something about the arrival of the next generation had made him feel the urgency of getting his own life organized. He was thinking about cattle, he said. He'd been thinking about what Jesse had told him, about the men who lasted being the ones with self-control and steady heads. He'd been thinking he might try to learn the trade properly, not the trail driving, but the buying and selling, the ranch management side of it. Jesse had connections in Abilene, he said. He'd mentioned there might be someone looking for a reliable hand who could learn the business. Clara looked at her younger brother, at the young man who was arriving, slowly but definitively, at something real, and said, "I think that's a very good idea, Thomas." He went to Abilene in the spring of 1880 with a letter of introduction from Jesse to a rancher named Mitchell who Jesse had driven cattle for several times and trusted. He wrote home regularly, which was not something anyone had expected, and his letters were enthusiastic and specific in the way his conversations had never quite managed to be, and Clara kept them in the drawer with Jesse's early letters, the ones from the trail, because she had decided to keep the things she wanted to keep. The years settled over the Creek farm the way good years do, with enough difficulty to keep things honest and enough grace to make the difficulty worth it. They had a drought in the summer of 1880 that tested the creek and the cattle both, and Jesse and Clara spent 3 hard weeks hauling water and managing the reduced grazing and making decisions together at the kitchen table with the accounts spread between them, and came through it without losing any cattle and without losing their heads or their patience with each other. They had a second child in 1881, a girl this time, born in April when the creek was running full and the willows were just leafing out. They named her Violet, which was Clara's choice, and Jesse said it was a fine name, and Violet Cade came into the world with considerably more noise and determination than her brother had and showed signs of maintaining both qualities. Jesse had, by this point, expanded the cattle operation to 20 head and was beginning to consider whether a second parcel of land was worth looking into. He talked it over with Clara as he talked over everything, and Clara ran the numbers twice and said she thought the second parcel was sound if they could negotiate the price down to what she specified, and Jesse went back to the owner and negotiated accordingly and got within $10 of her number, which he considered a success. The little house had grown by this point, the extra room built for Elia's now serving a different purpose, and a proper parlor had been added along the east side where Clara could have her books in decent order and receive visitors without it being the kitchen table. She had also, over these years, cultivated a garden that had expanded from vegetables to include medicinal plants and flowers, and the yard around the house had a kind of purposeful beauty that people mentioned when they visited. Women from the surrounding homesteads began to come to Clara for advice, not just about plants, but about all sorts of practical things, because she had the reputation of a woman who thought clearly and spoke honestly. She did not consider this a particular honor, only a practical consequence of being someone who had actually thought about things, but Jesse was quietly proud of it in a way that was characteristic of him, visible only if you knew where to look. In the fall of 1882, Louisa had a baby at last, a healthy boy she named William, and she came to the Creek farm the following week still pink with triumph and relief and happiness, and she sat in Clara's kitchen and they drank tea and looked at their children on the kitchen floor, Elias, who was nearly 3 and serious about everything, and Violet, who was 18 months and interested in everything, and William, who was 3 weeks old and interested only in eating. And they talked about how unlikely this all was, how different from what either of them had expected, and how entirely better. "Do you remember," Louisa said, "when Mama said you were too old to be loved?" "I remember," Clara said. "I have been thinking about that," Louisa said, "about how it was the most wrong thing I have ever heard her say." "She has never said it again," Clara said, which was true. Edith had never repeated it, not once, and Clara chose to take that as the apology her mother was not quite constituted to make directly. "It was still wrong," Louisa said firmly. "It was," Clara agreed. "But I think she was afraid for me, and fear makes people say things that are wrong." Louisa looked at her. "You're being generous." "I'm being honest," Clara said. "They're different things. She was afraid I would be alone. She was afraid no one would come." She was wrong about what that meant, but the fear was real. Louisa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And then a man rode past with a lame horse." "And then a man rode past with a lame horse," Clara agreed. They both looked at the children on the floor, and at the blue-flowered curtains in the window, and at the late afternoon light coming through warm and golden. And Clara thought about Jesse, who was out in the south field with Elias trotting beside him on his little legs, being introduced to the cattle in the serious way Jesse introduced people to things he wanted them to respect. She thought about the night she had sat in the tack room and told a stranger that her mother said she was too old to be loved, and about the way he had said, simply and without performance, that her mother was wrong. She thought about the 5 days that had followed and the 6 weeks after that, and the letter she had sent, and the letter she had received, and the afternoon in the empty house by the creek when he had crossed the room to her in 3 careful steps and asked her to spend her life there with him. She thought about how close it had all come to not happening. How if Harlan had not bruised his hoof on that particular road on that particular evening, Jesse would have ridden past, and she would have been at her stove, and neither of them would have known the difference. The enormous and arbitrary nature of it struck her with a force that was almost physical, the way great good luck can feel almost like grief because of how easily it could have been otherwise. She looked at Violet, who had gotten hold of a wooden spoon and was banging it on the floor with complete satisfaction, and felt something deep and sure move through her like the creek in the spring flood, warm and forceful, and belonging entirely where it was. Jesse came in from the south field with Elias riding on his shoulders, both of them pink-cheeked from the fall air. Elias was saying something about the cattle in the particular earnest way he had, and Jesse was listening with full attention, which was the way he always listened to the people he loved. He came into the kitchen and saw Clara and Louisa at the table and bent to set Elias down, and then straightened and looked at Clara in the way he had always looked at her, the way that was still the best thing she received every single day without exception. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is very all right," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot and settled into the chair beside her and listened, while Louisa told him about William's latest accomplishments, which at 3 weeks were limited but apparently remarkable to his mother. And the kitchen was warm and the light was good, and the children were on the floor and the cattle were settled in the south field, and the accounts were solid and the books were on the shelf in the parlor, and the mountains were still out there beyond the horizon, patient and enormous and not going anywhere. They had spoken of the mountains more than once in the years since that first conversation, and it had become, between them, a kind of shorthand for the things that were still possible, the things they had not yet done, the way the future was still open in front of them. It was in the spring of 1883 that Jesse sat down at the kitchen table with the accounts and the maps, and said that he thought the operation was stable enough that they could leave Thomas in charge for 3 weeks, and that he had been in correspondence with a family in Colorado who were willing to put them up for a few days, and that he thought the time had come. He slid the map across the table to her. It showed the rail routes from Dodge City west, and a line he had drawn in pencil from the Kansas border into Colorado, curving up into the mountains. Clara looked at the map for a long time. She looked at the mountains on the edge of the map, the small black marks that indicated peaks, and she thought about the words she had read in 100 descriptions and never been able to fully imagine. "Thomas is 22, Jesse said. "He knows the cattle. He can manage." "He can," Clara agreed. Thomas, shaped by 4 years in Abilene and the influence of people who had taken him seriously, had come home the previous year a genuinely capable young man, and had been helping on the Creek farm regularly while he planned his own future. "I said I would take you," Jesse said. "You did say that," Clara said. "I mean to keep my word." She looked at the map and at the pencil line and at the mountains at the edge of it, and she looked up at Jesse, who was watching her with the quiet certainty that was entirely characteristic of him, and she said, "When do we leave?" They left in May, on a morning so clear it was like the sky had been washed. They took the train from Dodge City, their first time on the train together, and the children were with Edith, who had agreed to the arrangement with only minimal objection and the reassurance that it would be for 3 weeks and not 4. Elias had wept when they left, which had been difficult, but Violet had been immediately interested in her grandmother's kitchen, which had helped. The train moved west through the flat land of Kansas, and Clara watched the country through the window, the great flat plain she had looked at her whole life, and felt the strangeness and beauty of it in a new way, seeing it from the outside, seeing it as the country it was and not just the country she was in. The sky was enormous. The grass was still winter pale but showing the first green of the season. Then the land began to change. It rose and folded in on itself, and the distances shifted, and the air coming through the cracked window tasted different, thinner and colder, and carrying something that was not quite like anything she had smelled before, something clean and ancient. And then the mountains appeared. They appeared all at once, on the western horizon, rising out of the plain as if they had simply been there, waiting for her to get close enough to see them, and Clara pressed her hands against the window glass and looked at them with the full capacity of her attention, and felt something happen in her chest that was larger than any word she had for it. Jesse was watching her face, not the mountains. She turned from the window and looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something he hadn't seen before, something that was wonder and recognition at once, the way you feel when a thing you have imagined for a very long time turns out to be true. "They're real," she said, which was not quite what she meant but was the closest she could get. "They are," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they rode into the mountains together with the window open and the cold, bright air coming through, and the peaks rising white and immense above the world they were traveling through. And Clara thought about the girl she had been at 19 when her father died, and the woman she had been at 32 sitting at the kitchen table when her mother told her she was too old, and the woman she was now. On a train going into the mountains with her husband's hand in hers, and she felt the whole long, complicated shape of the thing she had lived, and she was grateful for every inch of it. They spent 8 days in Colorado, and they saw the mountains from every angle the roads and trails allowed. And one afternoon they rode up a track into a canyon where the walls rose so high above them that the sky was only a strip of blue between the stone, and the creek at the bottom ran so cold and clear it made the Kansas Creek look modest by comparison. And Clara stood in the canyon with the rock walls on either side and her head tipped back looking up at the strip of sky, and felt something that was very close to prayer, or perhaps was prayer in the truest sense. Jesse stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. They went home to Kansas in the last week of May, with the mountains behind them and the flat land opening up again in front of them, and Clara did not feel that going home was a diminishment. She felt that home was where the children were, and where the creek ran through the willows, and where the books were on the parlor shelf, and where the cattle grazed in the south field, and that home was also every place she had been, and every conversation she had held in lamplight, and every letter sent into the uncertain distance, and returned with honest words in large handwriting. And that home was fundamentally and irreducibly the man sitting beside her on the train with his hat in his lap and his quiet dark eyes. They came back to the Creek farm on a Thursday evening, and Edith was in the kitchen having fed the children their supper, and Elias ran to meet them at the door with the particular urgent joy of a child who has been separated from his parents for what has felt, to him, like an eternity. And Jesse caught him up in both arms and held him with the careful firm gentleness he had for everything he cared about, and Clara crouched down for Violet, who was pulling at her skirt and saying her name with the imperious certainty of a 2-year-old, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of Edith's soup, and the lamp was lit, and the curtains were moving in the evening breeze. Edith looked at them with something that had gone entirely soft in it, the way her face had only ever gone a few times that Clara had witnessed, and she said, "You both look different." "Do we?" Clara said. "You look like people who have been somewhere good," Edith said. "We have," Clara said. "Mama, the mountains are real." Edith looked at her for a moment, And then she smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and she said, "Of course they are. I never said they weren't." Clara laughed, which was not something she did lightly, and Edith laughed too, and Jesse stood in the doorway with Elias on his hip, watching both of them with the expression he kept for moments when Clara was happy, which was the expression she was most fond of on his face. Thomas came for supper the following Sunday, which was his habit now, reliable and consistent, and he brought news of his own. He had put down money on a small parcel of land east of Dodge City and was thinking seriously about running his own cattle by the following spring. He laid the plans out on the kitchen table with the careful organization of a young man who has learned to think before he acts, and Jesse looked at the numbers with him, and Clara added her observations about the timing, and they talked it over as a family, which was what they were. And when Thomas left that evening, he shook Jesse's hand at the door and said, "Thank you for all of it." Jesse said it was nothing. Thomas said, "It's not nothing." And Jesse, because he was honest, said, "You're right, it isn't." The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, with the ordinary textures of working land and raising children, and the slow deepening of a life built together. Elias grew into a serious, bookish boy who loved the cattle as much as he loved his mother's library, which Jesse found entirely reasonable. Violet grew into a force of nature who had, by the age of 4, established herself as the person most likely to have an opinion about everything, and the least likely to be persuaded against it when she was right, which was irritatingly often. In 1885, Clara discovered she was expecting a third child, and received this news with the equanimity of a woman who has done this before and trusts the people around her. And Jesse received it with the same careful gravity he had brought to it the first 2 times, the same first question, "Are you well?" and the same reaching for her after. The third child was a boy, born in the spring of 1886, and they named him Robert, and he had Jesse's dark eyes and Clara's particular way of looking at things that was both direct and somehow also sideways, as if she were seeing more than the front of something. By 1887, the Creek Farm was a solid, productive enterprise that had grown to include 60 head of cattle and the second parcel of land, and a proper apple orchard that Clara had planted in 1881, and which was now beginning to produce in earnest. Edith Whitfield, having concluded that the arrangement had worked out in a manner that she was not displeased by, had taken to coming for Sunday supper regularly, and had established a particular relationship with Violet that was partly warfare and partly mutual admiration of the highest order. Thomas had his own operation running east of Dodge City and was doing well enough that he was thinking about a partner, and Clara suspected the partner he was thinking about was the daughter of the Mitchell rancher in Abilene, based on the way Thomas mentioned her with slightly more casualness than things that were actually casual required. She was right about this. He married Margaret Mitchell in the autumn of 1887 and brought her home to meet the family, and Clara liked her immediately, not because she was obliged to, but because Margaret was clear-eyed and sensible and laughed at the right things, and looked at Thomas with the particular expression of a woman who sees someone clearly and has decided the clear sight is acceptable, which Clara considered a very good sign. On a December evening in 1887, with the Kansas winter settled hard and white over the plains and the fire going well in the parlor, and the children asleep and Edith installed in the spare room because the roads were too rough to travel in the dark, Clara and Jesse sat together in the parlor with the lamp between them, she with a book and he with the accounts, which was their habitual arrangement. And after a while the accounts and the book were both put down, and they sat without them. Just the 2 people and the fire and the winter dark outside the windows. "I was thinking today," Clara said, "about the evening you came to the door." "So was I," Jesse said, which made her look at him. "What were you thinking about it?" she asked. "I was thinking about what would have happened if I had ridden past," he said, "if I had decided not to stop." "You almost didn't stop," she said. I watched you from the window. You stood at the gate for a while before you knocked." He looked at her. "Did you?" "I was at the kitchen window when you came into the yard. I watched you decide." He considered this for a moment, the idea of her at the window watching him make the decision. And his face did the thing she knew so well, the thing she had the most words for of any expression she had ever seen, the thing that was warm and quiet and entirely directed at her. "I almost didn't stop," he agreed. "I thought I should push on, that I'd find somewhere else. And I looked at the house and the lamp in the window, and something about it seemed worth stopping for," he said. "I cannot be more specific than that. There was something about it." She thought about the lamp in the window, her lamp, lit by her hand, throwing its light out into the dark of that April evening in 1878, and a man at the gate looking at it and deciding it was worth stopping for. "I'm glad you stopped," she said. "I am profoundly glad I stopped," he said. Outside the parlor windows, the Kansas winter was white and still, and the willows along the creek were bare, but their branches were dark against the snow, and the cattle were settled in the barn, and the apple trees were dormant and would bloom again in April, and the children were asleep in their beds with their particular faces that were made of both of them, and Elia's serious brow and Violet's opinionated chin, and Robert's sideways way of looking at things. Jesse reached over and took her hand in the firelight, and she felt the warmth of it move up through her the way it always had, and she looked at him across the length of his arm and the small space between their chairs, at the man who had come to her door with a lame horse and a hat in his hands and stayed for the rest of his life, and she thought about her mother's words, about being too old, about the world being done with her, and she thought that the world had, in fact, been just getting started. She was 32 when a stranger stopped in her yard and crouched beside her in lamplight, without making it a contest. She was 32 when she sat in a tack room and set down the weight of her mother's words. She was 32 when she looked out a window at the April sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the world might be larger than advertised. It was. It was considerably larger. The fire crackled, and the winter pressed quiet against the windows, and Clara Cade, née Whitfield, who had been told she was too old to be loved, held her husband's hand in the warm and lamplit parlor of the home they had built together, and felt the truth of a thing she had always suspected and finally knew with the full authority of a life lived well and on her own terms. Love does not arrive on schedule. It does not consult the family almanac or abide by the practical arithmetic of your mother's expectations. It does not stop because you have reached an age that someone else has deemed inconvenient. It arrives when it arrives, often at dusk, often with a lame horse, often before supper is done, and it does not wait to be declared appropriate before it begins. And if you have kept the lamp in your window and the door unlocked, if you have kept yourself genuinely open to the sound of hoofbeats on the road even in the years when the road was quiet, then when it comes to your gate, you will recognize it, and you will open the door.